God's grace becomes known for us when we are seen. It's one way. When we begin to know that God sees us is when we recognize how God is in our lives. My seminary was in a south side neighborhood called Hyde Park, densely populated area like one would expect. And across the road from that campus was a park. Not a huge park. It had like a small little dirt ball diamond, and there's a couple of hills, but it wasn't that big. Pretty big, I guess, for a small, neighborhood park. And periodically, a homeless individual or maybe a homeless couple would come and they would take up residency in this park. No big deal, never intrusive, maybe living in a corner or grabbing one of the benches and propping their tent and putting out their supplies there. They'd be there for a few days, and then I would imagine they're probably getting shooed off by the police. One of our homeless neighbors came across the road to the campus. Our campus we have benches everywhere. You could probably go about 10 feet and you'd find another bench. We have all these benches, and so this individual came over and sat in one of the benches by one of the main entrances to one of our buildings and would ask for help. Again, very low-key, not intrusive, not aggressive, no big deal. And some of us would maybe not strike up a conversation because that sounds a little bit more than what it was, but maybe just ask how they were doing, see if there was something specific that they were looking for. For instance, I had a colleague while we were on campus this was wintertime, and in the wintertime, they had a coat with a ton of pockets in a big, fluffy coat. And they would stuff socks and mittens into like every pocket of their coat because part of their work was engaging homeless people. And so we had this homeless individual on our campus, and that's what they did, gave them socks and mittens. Now, I would love to tell you, in light of our gospel that we have for tonight, that at some point we as a group, maybe some of us as students on campus, organized around this homeless individual and helped them to fill out a resume and a job application and maybe find them a couple places where they could apply and help them find shelter and get them their Medicaid and their food stamps and all the government aid that they were deserving. And I would love to tell you that a group of us then, found a spot where they could get cleaned up and maybe get a new suit or a new piece of clothing that they could go to the interview. Maybe we even got them a bus pass to get them there. And then we coached them on how to do a really great interview. And then I could tell you that they got the job. And they were able to make an income and maybe pay for a garden-level apartment for a couple of months and climb their way up into middle-class prosperity. The reality is what happened is after a couple of days, our homeless neighbor moved on, found another spot, never saw him again. But I hope for a couple of days that our homeless neighbor, when they came and hung out on our campus, I hope that when folks learned his name, when folks learned a little bit about him, that he was seen, that he was heard, I hope he recognized that we saw him as human. Because that's what Jesus does in our gospel, in our reading for tonight. Jesus sees Bartimaeus as human. It's hard to say anything more than that, but Jesus hears Bartimaeus calling for him. And by the way, Mark, here we are in chapter 10. Mark tells us that his name is Bartimaeus, and then in the gospel reading, maybe you didn't catch it, but he says, Bartimaeus, Timaeus' son. Bartimaeus just means son of Timaeus. This is a little bit of a tell that Mark probably wasn't Hebrew born. He probably wasn't Jewish in origin. But this story survived. The story has been passed down through the generations, and it made it to Mark, and it made it to pen and papyrus. And 2,000 years later, we have a gentleman who lived his life on the side of the road, outside of town, who cried out to Jesus, and Jesus saw him. There's power in being seen. There's power in being known and being recognized and being treated human. At some point in our lives, every single one of us as humans, we feel invisible or unseen or unrecognized. Or maybe we can pass through the halls of our school or pass through the halls of our work, or maybe walk up and down these streets and no one knows our name, or maybe no one calls us out, or no one speaks to us. Every one of us at some point in our life, we have felt almost as if we don't exist. Bartimaeus. Mark tells us that he was a beggar, which then we could infer in that he was probably homeless, that he probably had very little in his life. Mark tells us that when Jesus calls him forward, calls him away from that dirt pile that he would have been sitting on the side of the road, that he throws off his coat. That's probably one of his only possessions. Maybe he had a few other things around him. He probably slept somewhere else. But the essence of his life was where he sat there on the side of the road, where he was told to sit and stay out of the way. Mark tells us that he's blind. So he has these physical obstacles, he has these economic obstacles, he has these social obstacles to being part of the community, maybe being part of his family, and here comes Jesus. In Mark, we are in chapter 10. In chapter 11, for those of us who might have our Bible in our lap or go home and read it later tonight, your subheading will tell you that at chapter 11 is when Jesus marches triumphantly into Jerusalem. And for those of us who hang out here for any period of time, that's Palm Sunday. So we're not going to read chapter 11 next week. I'll invite you to come back in late March when we read it. But that's where we're at in the story. Jesus has been telling the disciples, I'm going to Jerusalem. And when I get to Jerusalem, I'll be arrested, I will be put on trial, I will be tortured, and I will die. The proclamation of the cross. And now here we are, outside of Jericho. We could have maybe in our minds that CGI image of he's looking off towards Jerusalem and it's up on a hill, and maybe you can see the very roof line and the top of the temple peeking out over the wall of the Jerusalem city and the gates that he's going to go in and out, and for really good CGI effect, maybe it's a little dusty, but you also have the doves that are flittering off and flying away. You got one of those great scenes. That's how close we are. He's almost there. And this is, we could maybe argue, one of the last public ministries that he does. He's heading towards the gate. He's on a mission. He is headed towards the cross, and he's taking all of us with him, whether we want to go or not. And along the way, here's this guy, Bartimaeus, who's been told to sit there and stay out of trouble and stay out of town, stay out of the center of existence, and he dares to hear that Jesus is coming and cries out for mercy. And the crowds, some of whom maybe were his neighbors, some of whom maybe were his family, some of whom were the disciples, his faithful followers, tell Bartimaeus, be quiet. Stay out of the way. Jesus is on a mission. He's headed forward. He's getting to Jerusalem. He's almost there. We can't stop him now. And by the way, you don't deserve to talk to Jesus. They push him to the side of the road. They tell him to be silent. They cast him out. And he cries out for mercy again. He cries out to Jesus. And Jesus hears him, sees him, and invites him forward. There's so many fun little details about this story that we can't get into unless we had a Bible study to really dig in. But one of the interesting little details of this story is how the crowds are pushing Bartimaeus away. They're telling him to be silent, stay out of the way. And then when Jesus says, I want to talk to him, the crowds are like, oh my goodness, he wants to talk to you. Quick, part the seas, everybody, let's get him over here as quick as possible. Because there is power in being seen. There's power in being recognized. There's power in God coming to us as we are and loving us as we are and saying our name and offering us a word of grace. And the grace in this gospel is when Jesus encounters Bartimaeus, he asks him one question. What can I do for you? Jesus, God's Son. Bartimaeus calls him Son of David. He knows that at the very least, he's anointed to be a king. If he's not a king yet, maybe he's about to become a king. But he's got power. He's got authority. Clearly, he has God on his side. This is Jesus who has cast out demons. This is Jesus who has healed multitudes. This Jesus comes to this man, one of thousands who would be sitting along the side of the road when dignitaries come by, and he simply asks, what can I do for you? How can I serve you? Jesus has been telling us ever since the first pages of the Gospel of Mark that our call as Jesus' faithful disciples, his followers, is to take ourselves out of the center, to put in the center of our lives the cross, which then becomes the vulnerable, the oppressed, those who have been silenced. So Jesus is modeling grace. And there are times in our lives when we are called to offer this grace and be of service, and there are times in our lives when we get to receive grace. Jesus coming to us, coming to you, and saying, what can I do for you? We've all been invisible. We've all found ourselves on the outside of a group or the outside of the community or the outside of a discussion or the outside of this church. We've all found ourselves pushed out for one reason or another. Maybe it's because of our gender. Maybe it's because of our economic status. Maybe it's because of our history of whether or not we've spent enough time in these walls or in this community. We've all found ourselves outside of something, some group that won't let us in. Jesus, through this gospel, is connecting us to Bartimaeus, a beggar who is blind, who is oppressed, who has no voice. We are reminded in this gospel how close we are to our neighbors and how close our neighbors are to each one of us. We know what it means to be invisible. We know what it means to be pushed to the side of the road. Jesus comes to us and offers grace, a promise that Jesus will love us, forgive us, heal us, transform us, and draw us back into the center. When Bartimaeus comes to Jesus and Jesus asks, "What can I do for you?" Bartimaeus asks for one thing. He wants to see. Now, on one level, I suppose that makes sense because he is blind, so he wants to see, but the healings in the Gospel of Mark, every single one of them is not just about a physical impairment. It is about being cast out. And the healing is about being brought back into community, being brought back into the presence of God, being brought back into the center, being brought back into the family, being brought back into a relationship with God and our neighbors. Bartimaeus wants to see. He wants to be in the community. He wants to be with his family. He wants to know that he's a child of God. And I would dare say he wants to see the glory of God unfolding all around him. And this gift of grace that Jesus gives us is that vision that we can see God's glory unfolding all around us, in our lives, in our neighbors' lives, those whom we worship with, those whom we love, those whom we work alongside, and maybe even those whom we count as our adversaries. This is grace, God's grace, transforming our vision, transforming our hearts, transforming us, and acknowledging that we are human, acknowledging that we are worthy of love, acknowledging that we are worthy of forgiveness, acknowledging that we are worthy of all of God's goodness and abundance in our lives every day. Jesus is offering for us through this story a vision of how he takes himself out of the center and places the cross where we find the vulnerable, the oppressed, and where we find ourselves. The days when we push ourselves as far away from God as we possibly can and get ourselves to the outskirts, and the days when we have been pushed out, Jesus keeps drawing us back, loving us, transforming us, washing us in grace, and then sending us out with a new vision so that we can see God's grace unfolding in the lives of our neighbors. Amen.